Hello, and welcome to Masters with Masters. This is a special program where we bring together experts and leaders and practitioners of aerospace to share some of their stories and their lessons in terms of working with NASA and on the missions that they've been involved with. And we have two special guests with us today. We have Jerry Clubb and we have Dave Mobley, and I'll introduce them shortly. I want to start by thanking the Marshall Space Flight Center. We're shooting this session here at Marshall, and want to thank Marshall Space Flight Center Chief Knowledge Officer Dale Thomas for helping to set it up. Our Chief Knowledge Integrator Jennifer Stevens. Also like to thank the great support we've had from the Public Affairs Office and from the communications team, and of course from NASA TV. So wanted to say that up front. The sessions are interactive, so if there are questions, you can certainly get them to us, or I'm sure we'll have a lot of exchange going here. And we record all these sessions so that they're available in different formats in the websites that we have and in the training programs that we do. And so I'd like to start by welcoming and thanking to the far corner Dave Mobley. Dave has had a remarkable career of over 50 years in aerospace and in the engineering experience. He's worked 35 years with NASA at the Marshall Space Flight Center, at Kennedy, at Johnson in Utah. He's worked on missions like the International Space Station and involved with just about all of our international space partners. He was also part of the space station redesign team and led the NASA team that incorporated the Russian partners into the International Space Station. He served as NASA's chief engineer and as a member of General Stafford's Shuttle Mir Rendezvous and Docking Task Force, and I can keep going on, but I won't, and so I'll thank you, Dave, for joining us today.
You're welcome.
And I also want to welcome Jerry Clubb, who before coming to NASA, spent a couple of years here at Redstone with the U.S. Army, and then spent over 34 years at the Marshall Space Flight Center. Served his first position as the division chief of the astronautics laboratory. He transferred to the Johnson Space Center, where he initially was responsible for the avionics design of the International Space Station, and was later responsible for the international partner avionics integration for ISS. He was a member of the Johnson Space Center for over 14 years, and mostly was in Moscow, and he talked about the frequent flyer models in terms of the work. And he's considered one of the world's premier avionics software, hardware, and integration experts. And again, as in Dave, I can keep going on, but would run out of time. But I thank you for taking the time to share some of your knowledge and wisdom with us.
Thank you.
Sure. I think it probably makes sense to start with your career. And how did you get into aerospace and NASA, and what are some of the key points in terms of how you ended up doing what you ended up doing? So.
Well, I grew up on a farm in rural southeast Missouri. In fact, I had 15 in my senior class, to give you an indication of where we were. After my father died whenever I was a senior in high school, and when I got out of high school with careful planning and working, I was able to get through engineering school. And I graduated from Missouri School of Mines. And at that time, the draft was in effect, and I had to accept a deferment to finish the last semester of college. And if you, in the county that I was in, if you ever accepted a deferment, you immediately got drafted when you got out of school. And when I was interviewing for positions when I graduated from college, I was offered jobs in the defense industry, which they said that one of the benefits is they would get me a deferment, so that I wouldn't have to serve in the military. But I came from a military family, and somehow it just seemed like that I probably ought to serve in the military. And so I went ahead and made the decision. I went ahead and was drafted. And that turned out to be one of the wisest decisions that I ever made, because I had a friend that was in the Army, and he was working at Redstone Arsenal, and he told me that when I got in the Army, if I had an opportunity to tell him where I would like to serve, tell him that I need to come to Redstone Arsenal. So I told him that when I was processing into the Army, and when I got out of basic training, then I got sent to Fort Monmouth, New Jersey. So I thought, well, that's typical for the Army. And they sent me to basic electronics school, and I had just graduated with a double-E degree in engineering, and we started off studying in Ohm's law, and I didn't have a whole lot of trouble with it. But I graduated. They found out that I really didn't belong in that class, so they sent me to Redstone Arsenal and to ABMA. So I spent 2 years there, and when I got out of the Army, why, I went to work for NASA. And like I say, I probably would not have been working with NASA if I had not got into the U.S. Army.
The early experiences.
Yes, and we started working. We were working 12 hours a day. That was when we were really in going to the moon, and we were working 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. And it was a dream for a young engineer, because we had all the work we could do, and I really believe some of us would have worked for nothing, because we were going to the moon. And when I was in high school, I remember reading that they bounced a signal. They sent a signal to the moon and reflected it back to the Earth and detected it. And I thought that was amazing. And the same article said that one day there would be a rocket that would go to the moon. And I thought to myself, I would love to see such a machine. And then here I was working on designing a machine to go do that. And that was absolutely a dream come true. So,
yeah, so you start off in a classroom of 15, and then you're working on the mission to the moon, and later on with the international partners.
And I've been one of the most fortunate people in the world. I've enjoyed excellent health all my life, had an outstanding family, and had a career that people just dream of. So.
Okay. And we'll talk more about that. Dave, what about your starting point and critical experiences?
Well, like Jerry, I grew up on a farm in South Georgia, and there was 17 in my graduating class. With 1 year of algebra, no chemistry, no physics.
All right.
But it really started when I was 15. I contracted polio, and I had finally worked my way into a wheelchair, and I wasn't sure I'd ever get out of it because I was in a plateau that you often hit. And a friend of the family who was an engineer in the Corps of Engineers, civil engineer in the Corps of Engineers, came to visit me and tried to convince me to go to college. And I didn't think much about that until he told me that he made $12,000 a year. And I thought, dadgum, I don't know what an engineer is, but if you can make $1,000 a month, I'm going to go be one. So I went off to college, and I registered as a first quarter freshman, and the lady asked me, what was I going to major in? I said, I'm going to be an engineer. And she asked me what kind. I asked her how many kinds were there. She gave me a list, and I went and thought about that, and I came back and said, I'm going to be an electrical engineer. She asked me what kind. I said, dadgum, how many kinds are there? But anyway, I finally decided on that. I spent a lot of time in the library trying to catch up with them guys who graduated from Montgomery and Birmingham, the big schools, that had the classes I did. But I learned a valuable lesson. I learned how to think and manage my time. And then I heard about Sputnik, of course, like everybody did. And then I heard about Werner von Braun, and I wasn't sure exactly what he was doing, but I decided I wanted to go help him do it. And since he was in Huntsville, Alabama, which wasn't too far from where I was, that's where I wanted to go. And the day that NASA came to the campus, I had a conflict with a final exam. So as that was over with, I drove to Huntsville and talked my way past the gate guards, got a series of interviews, and accepted a job offer as a system engineer, and reported to work in 1961. The first day at work before lunch, I was pulling cables to hook up the Saturn I vehicle to the ground support equipment to do post-manufacturing testing. And it was a dream come true. It was fun. And I worked as a test engineer, even went down to California, Rockwell International Command and Service Module, and after the Apollo fire with Dr. Brees and his team, and then back here as a test engineer on Skylab. Then I went to Europe to work Space Lab, working for ESA, actually he's a supervisor.
Wow.
Which was an interesting experience, but we gained a lot of trust and respect and recognition of each other that came in very handy when they showed back up on on space station. In fact, Frank Longhurst came back as their manager for their elements, who was my supervisor. And then, of course, there was space station redesign, which they asked me to come to headquarters Crystal City for 6 weeks. And before I got through, I was there 3 years, working with the Russians to try to get them involved in the space station. And part of that 3 years, the NASA administrator, Mr. Golden, asked me to be the NASA chief engineer. That lasted a short time because I wanted to come home. I finally talked my way into back home and then retired. But it's been fun.
Amazing, amazing careers. Almost don't know where to start, but I feel like I got to go back to, so you both got your grounding in your engineering and your leadership by the moon program, going to Apollo. Right. Can you talk about what is it that made you stand out? What is it that gave you the experience, the capability? How did you approach a mission that was that large in terms of developing your engineering skills, your leadership skills, your collaboration skills?
Well, I was a system test engineer for a stabilized platform, which I'd never heard of before. And I had a technician assigned to me, and it took me about 30 minutes to figure out that I was his engineer if I just shut up and listened to him. He taught me a lot. There was a lot of folks that helped you, a lot of folks that mentored you, allowed you to make mistakes if the consequences wasn't too severe, and stopped you before you made mistakes. But you progress through that, and you learn, and you do more, and you have your own ideas and different ways of doing it. And there was no automation then, but we finally got a computer, and that was really a learning experience. Our RCA 110 vacuum tube computer had an air conditioner bigger than the computer to keep it all cool. So it's just a matter of progression and watching people, watching leaders, picking the best, emulating where you can. One of the things that really impressed me and most everybody back those days was Von Braun would drive his little 2-seater convertible right into the High Bay area, 4708, and get out and walk in your office. And you're talking about inspiring folks to work.
It's like, what's going on?
Yep. He introduced himself to me and asked me what was I doing, and I told him I was trying to figure out if you push that way on a stabilized platform, why does it go that way? And he told me to call Dr. Reese, and he explained it to me, but I didn't call Dr. Reese. But that was a lesson that stuck by me all the rest of my career. If you're going to be a leader, you got to get out there and lead and be active and do something. You can't sit in the office and send emails.
Right. So you talk about the purpose and the excitement about the mission, and you talk about getting involved in the work, and you talked about having leaders who are right in there alongside you. Right. Jerry, what's your recollections? And
and it's interesting about Dr. Von Braun. He had that blue Mercedes, and we had a taxi service at the center, and he would go to the various meetings and so forth, and sometimes he'd drive his car, and sometimes he'd take a taxi, and at the end of the day he'd have to call MPs to tell him where his car was so he could go find his car. But anyway, I worked with a lot of good people, and the Germans had the philosophy, and they were really running the organization whenever I came here, but they had the philosophy that we do everything in the labs, and that we know more than what our contractors is doing. We were expected to do hands-on, and we had breadboards, and we designed components, and we designed systems, and like I say, we were expected to be able to direct the contractor and challenge him and argue with him about whether the decisions they were making were right or not. And I worked with some really good people, including one of them was Olin King, who left NASA and formed SCI and a worldwide electronics company. He was very good individual to work with. I wouldn't want to work for him, but he was very good to work with. And a lot of good people like that, and they would give us tasks to do that they knew were challenging, and they would let us go. And if it said if you get into trouble, let us know and we'll come and help you. But there was somebody, if you had any kind of problem that you needed solved or you couldn't understand, you could find somebody there that could tell you what you needed to do. So I listened to a lot of people, and it was very interesting work. And like I say, we would have worked for nothing, I believe.
Yeah. You probably don't want to say that too many times, because with the finances of the government, they may retroactively.
Right.
But
Yeah.
they'll relieve that. Both of you you've talked about obviously a stimulating environment, and you've talked about working with what I call extraordinary leaders and people, and your careers are amazing. I mean, you're extraordinary leaders and heroes to a lot of the folks here. What is it that makes a person an outstanding leader?
Let me add one thing before.
Yeah.
Okay. We were instilled with a philosophy, at least in the laboratory where that I worked, that if we had problems, we were going to the moon,
Right.
and it was a very complicated mission, but if we had problems, it was not going to be because of something that I did or something that I did not do.
Right.
That our system was going to work.
Okay.
And that's what they instilled in everyone in the laboratory, and that's why we really did everything we could to ensure that we were not going to have problems with our systems. It wasn't going to be our fault.
Right.
So,
Right, so a commitment to technical excellence, doing whatever you need to do. You talk about working 6 days a week and
That
all
was
that.
normal work
Yeah.
back then.
yes. So go ahead. I forgot what you asked now.
Well, no, I don't know. Were you going to add anything, Dave, about what?
I think that was center-wide.
Okay.
What Jerry said about his lab, it was pretty much center-wide. You did the best you could and whatever it took.
Yeah, so the passion comes through and the commitment to it. Yeah, what I was asking about is you've talked about working with Werner von Braun. You've talked about working with extraordinary people who started, companies, and obviously you both had extraordinary careers. What are some of the ingredients that leads to excellence as a leader? What?
Well, I think a leader is out doing and not sitting in his office. That was the first lesson I learned.
Right.
Absolutely.
I think the other one is developing trust and respect. That's extremely important. Trust comes from personal integrity. Respect comes from that personal integrity and technical competence. You can certainly work with people you don't trust, but it sure is hard.
Yeah.
And I believe that NASA's greatest asset is not their facilities, it's the people they've got. I believe that strongly. The other one is you got to listen to folks and get inputs until they start repeating themselves, and then you make a decision and get on with it. And most folks who you have developed trust and respect with will go give it a shot of whatever you decide, even if they think there might be a better way. And there's another one that I ran across called from Calvin Coolidge. I'm going to paraphrase it. Nothing in the world can replace persistence. Talent cannot. This world's full of unrewarded, talented people. Education won't do it either. There's a lot of folks that don't make it with education, and I forgot the third one. But the point is, persistence and hanging in there and getting the job done is what will get it done.
Yeah, and of course the nature of the work, I mean, whether it's Apollo or International Space Station or Hubble, is that these are incredibly long duration missions from concept to, to ultimate success, and a lot of challenges and problems, and how do you persevere through that?
Well, the other thing that I learned is that if you can keep it technical, even though you're dealing with other people or a contractor or an international partner, whatever, if you keep it strictly technical, that is, don't let contracts and in-scope, out-of-scope, money, etc. Engineers will come together as a team to find a solution,
Right.
Which is hard to do sometimes,
Right.
but it works every time. Let somebody else go worry about the contract, the in-scope, out-of-scope, and the dollars.
So making sure there's a focus in terms of what we're committed to, and the engineering and the
Right.
technical, and not get distracted by many things.
Well, you choose up sides when you bring in money and contracts, et cetera, and therefore you're no longer a single unified team working to some solution.
Yeah, it's been one of the themes before this. We talked with Dale Thomas and Helen McConaughey, and they were talking about the sense of you have to make sure it's about us and going towards it. And I think that's probably what you're talking about. Jerry, what's your thoughts about your great leadership or Dave's great leadership and the people that, that got you here?
I would echo what he said. One of the most important things is trust. You have to have people that will be honest with you and that you can trust. Like in the launch vehicle business, milliseconds out of control and you lose a vehicle and people can die. So you've got to be able to rely on what people tell you. And go back to the Germans again, they were very good at finding out whether you would tell them more than you knew or not.
Right.
And once they found out that they could rely on you, then they did. And if they found out that you couldn't, then you were kind of shuffled aside. So managers have to make a decision, and the people under them are going to give them advice, and they're going to make one decision one way or the other. So they need the best advice that the people can give them, whether it's popular advice or not. You need to be honest with them and tell them here's the situation. And to be a good leader, I fortunately, when I went to work, a boss told me, he said, there's two things, if you want to rise to the top and be a good manager, there's two things. You need to have a good stomach, and I didn't understand what that meant at the time, but I do, and I'll say more about that later. But the other one is you need to understand management, and he said you should go to all of the meetings that you can and watch how decisions are made and how that the managers operate, especially the Germans, because they operate in a particular manner. And I found out one was that if you have a position and there's a decision to be made, you argue your position to the best that you can, and if that you cannot convince them that your position is right and the decision is made to go the other way, then let it go and support that decision just as if that was your own decision, because you had your choice, you had your chance to convince people that they were right, but don't be any sour grapes or I told you so. And that was the Germans' way of doing business, and they would have knockdown, drag out arguments and fights, and everybody got to say their piece. But then once a decision was made, everybody got behind it.
You lined up and you moved forward.
Right. Yes.
Right. Okay. And I want to make sure we come back to this having a stomach for management.
Yes.
So we don't forget that. I mean, both partly what you're talking about is the nature of you're dealing with massively complex missions. You know, probably the epitome of complexity in terms of human endeavor, and so it comes down to working together. And you talk about sometimes being in situations where you're in arguments, you're in disagreements, you're fighting things out. How did you go about creating effective collaborative relationships with folks who worked for you, worked with you, and of course with international partners? Both of you are active in that. How do you get to that kind of a point where you have those effective relationships?
Well, the people that work for you, you want their inputs, and you ought to listen to all those inputs until they start repeating themselves. And then you go off and think about that and decide on the course of action, and they got two options: either do what you want to go do or work somewhere else. Now, dealing with partners and peers is a different situation. And again, the only thing that I found that truly worked was keep it technical. Keep personalities out of it. Keep it purely technical, and sooner or later engineers will come around and try to find a solution to a problem. And then let somebody else or deal with the contracts, et cetera, non-technical stuff after you've reached some solution. Sometimes you have to go back and find a less elegant solution that has a slightly more risk but potentially is more workable because it's not quite so elegant. But that's just part of the process. The international partners was most difficult. First, there's not a common culture to deal with, but that don't last too long. Well, it did with the Russians. It lasted a long time. But with the Europeans, it didn't last too very long. Once you get past that and understand their culture and how they do business and how they work, again, it works on dealing with strictly technical. But the Russians were a much different problem, much different.
And what was the challenge? What was the challenge there, if you can talk to that?
Well, the first time they came to town, that I got sent over to begin discussions with them about what could they do in the space station. Right. And that's about all the instructions I got. We couldn't agree on where we were going to meet. We couldn't agree on what time we were going to meet, what we were going to talk about, even where we were going to sit. It was frustrating. And the language and translation was another problem. That made things much, much worse. I had this lady who was my interpreter, a very nice lady, but she was not very technical. She made a lot of translation errors, which Russians thought I was probably an idiot. But the straw that broke the camel's back is I was talking about a hydro ram, and she translated it as water goat. And that about, well, that didn't cause the end of the discussions, but this took almost 2 weeks, and we wasn't making any progress at all. But in parallel with that, there was political discussions going on about selling missile technology to Iran that I didn't know about. Mm-hmm. But over the weekend, the Russians went away, and that's what I was told. The talks, political talks with them about Iran and missile technology had reached a stalemate, so they all went home. I went back to space station redesign. And a week or 2 or 3 weeks later, they showed back up. We had the same problems all over again, except less. And a good friend of mine named Chuck Daniel and I were working with him, and we decided that we had to figure out who was a technical guy. And after some thought, we put a pad of paper in front of each one of them with a magic marker, and we asked their interpreter a technical question. I forgot what it was. And we watched to see who picked up a pen and started drawing and talking, because we figured that Russian engineers were like us. We can't talk without a piece of paper and a pencil. And it turned out it was Leonard Gorshkov, who was the chief engineer of NPO Energia. And once we isolated him out, things got a lot better.
Okay.
A lot better.
So it goes back to understanding also who you're working with and what the roles are. Yeah.
Their interpreter turned out to be more than an interpreter. He was a manager at NPO Energia. But he put spin on the technical inputs we found out later about contracts and how much we were going to pay and how much latitude they have and how much information they could give us without us paying, et cetera, et cetera. But by then I had a NASA guy who was an interpreter. He named Martin Forkosh, Glenn Research Center. He immigrated from the Soviet Union in his early 20s. Good engineer, obviously understood the Russian culture and the NASA culture. So he could take the spin off of what the technical guys actually said.
Yeah, and Martin's now the Chief Knowledge Officer at Glenn. So
yep.
he's
good friend of mine.
Still doing it.
Very good friend of mine.
So it's understanding the people and the relationships and focusing on finding the technical commonality. Anything else you'd add, Sherry, in terms of the relationships, the collaboration?
We had the same problem that he had, and the first time that we went over to Moscow to meet with the people, we sat across the table and we wouldn't even talk to each other. And there was no exchange of information, and it was a useless trip. So I decided we had to do something to get past that. And I thought about it a lot, and it made one of the few good decisions in my career, I think. They were going to put up the first module, the Russian module was, and they needed a computer for it. And we had computers for our systems. And I decided that, and they were going to have to come here and verify their software and all of their systems, here being JSC at that time. So I said, let's give them our computer and the support equipment for it. And our contractor had a fit over that. They absolutely did not want to give the Russians our computer, but I was able to convince management, and we gave them a computer for their module, and we gave them the test equipment to go with it, And that ensured, at least when they brought their hardware over here, their systems over here, they understood what we had and how that it would work and how the software and all worked. And that broke the ice with the Russians, and then they were convinced that I was really trying to make the program go. And they were very proud of that equipment, that the ground equipment that we gave them, and put it in a show place over there. And that got us started. From then on, the relationship went very well after that.
So again, it's finding that common area and then building the trust. Also, it sounds like on your part, then you're having to kind of create relationships not only with your partners, with your team, but also with upper management in terms of getting their support for what you're trying to do.
Yes.
And that module he was talking about was called the FGB. Right. In English, it means Functional Cargo Block. And I was leading a team that put that into the program. And in order to do that, we took out hardware out of the concept of ISS from Info Energia, and the FGB belonged to a company called Krunishev. Immediately walked into a fight between two Russian companies, which was not pleasant or short-lived, but we finally succeeded in putting it in there, and I was supporting Jerry's decision back home. It was the only thing that would make the thing work. It gave us a tremendous advantage because Space Station Freedom, we had to build from the outside in because our solar arrays was out on the trusses. That meant it was, all the electronics was in a very harsh environment of space and a lot of redundancy, no capability to keep it from all falling out of the sky if we couldn't get back to it. The FGB, which I called a KGB one time in a meeting with the Russians, we broke up the meeting there for a little while, allowed us to build it from the outside in. And putting in this computer and that software was key to making that happen. And we reduced our risk of that because the FGB had proven in-space restart engine capability. And then we could take out some of that redundancy because it was in a benign environment inside the manned volume. It was a very, very good decision. And the computer and the software was absolutely key to making that decision work.
And going back a little bit, talking about how that he really got me involved in the space station. To me, one of the amazing things about the space station program was that it went for 10 years and got funded each year, and we really never built anything. It was a continuous argument about what it was going to be and what the concept was. And it had turned into, for want of better words, a giant computer in the sky. And the problem with it was that why they could never agree on anything is the software was so complicated that I don't believe anyone could have ever written the software, and I feel quite sure they couldn't have verified the software. And it was such that everything went back to the central computer, and they had high-speed fiber optic networks, and all that data flowed around, and any kind of change indicated that you had to verify all of the software again. So I was down at JSC helping them, and Dave came over and told me, he said, "I've been told to get you back to the center by dark today." And I said, "What's going on?" He said, "I don't know, but I've been told the center's going to close if you don't get back, if I don't get you back by dark." And I said, "What in the world have I done now, Dave?" But anyway, what that was, NASA had released 3 study contracts about how we were going to go from Freedom to the space station that we have now. And I was to lead the avionics portion of that. That's why they sent me back. So we did all of that, and I recognized right off that the software was the problem and it was too complicated. So we went to the concept. I said, let's go to a distributed concept where we'll push all of the authority down to the lowest level that we can, and that let the systems run themselves. And if they need help, they go up to the next level and ask for help. For example, let's say that this system down here normally operates with 1,000 watts. And there's some operation coming up that I'm going to need 2,000 watts. Okay, it has to go back to the power management system and say, I need you to schedule me 2,000 watts and send it down. But the real beauty of that was all of those systems could operate their software relatively independent as long as they kept the interface constant. and they could completely change their software as long as the interface stayed constant. It didn't ripple back, and you had to do all of that verification. And that's one of the other better decisions that I made.
It sounds like you made a lot of better decisions. When did you start working together, and how does that relationship form? Was it organizationally they put you together, and but it sounds like you kept looking to each other. So how does that happen?
Best of my memory, the first time I ran across Jerry was on Space Lab,
Right.
and Space Lab payloads, and there wasn't a lot of avionics there, but there was a lot of problems with Space Lab. The first time of anything, you got integration problems. But after we got all those problems basically solved, it was pretty much standard, get it ready to fly. The real working relationship began on Space Station Freedom.
Okay.
We had a thing called Turbo. I don't remember why it's called that, but
It was a Tiger team, but they said it needed to be stronger than a Tiger team, so they called it a Turbo team.
yeah.
That was Thorson's
Yeah.
idea.
Well, we went off site at the center. All the centers did. We had work package 1 here. We went off center to try to reduce the complexity of it, and like Jerry said, avionics and software and mass was the main targets. And that's when I really worked very closely with Jerry. It didn't take me long to figure out that he had the ability to separate what was necessary from the nice to have and what won't work. And once you reach that decision, it goes back to trust and respect. And whatever he said after that, I took as gospel and didn't quiz him too bad. And then, of course, the bringing in the Russians was a lot of passing each other as we were going and coming back to Moscow and running each other at the Pinta and the Volga apartments, etc.
Right. And so one of the things I think you'd probably say is a tip or advice is find people who are very good at what they do, and people that you learn to trust, and you know how to operate with each other, and you try to stay connected as long as you can.
Sooner or later, you'll get to the point where you can almost finish their sentences.
Right.
You have that much experience and trust and respect for.
Right.
Yes.
Do you see? So obviously, NASA's going through major changes now. You know, post shuttle era, and looking to define the mission of where we go in terms of the program that we have. Do you see similar things going on today in terms of some of the challenges in dealing with change from one major landmark program over 30 years then to the search for the new one? And what advice can you give us? Is it harder today? Is it easier today? Is it the nature of our business that when you change dramatically, you need to come together?
I think it's harder nowadays. The past programs, Apollo, Skylab, Space Lab, Freedom, had a clear, well-defined objective and mission. It's not so clear today what the mission is. There was not a lot of, there may have been a lot of politics involved back then, but we were immune to it, basically.
Okay.
Maybe we're just more aware of it now. I understand we were started for political reasons, and we stayed in business. We were started to compete with the Russians. Then we wound up staying in the manned space flight business by cooperating with the Russians, which was hard to accept initially, but after a while it began to make some sense. Besides that, the boss said, go do it, so you went and do it. So there was a clear mission there, clear objective. They may be now, but I don't understand it too well.
Right. So the importance of the clarity of the objective, and that allows you to focus on the technical and the team and go in a direction.
That's right.
Like
sure.
I told my people working for me once, it's really too bad that you will probably never work on a program like Apollo, because we had adequate funding, we had a clear goal in mind, and we had everybody from the taxi drivers and the janitors to Congress trying to help us get to the moon. And you know, you can't ask for anything better than that. And we really haven't had quite that clear objective and that cooperation on any program since. So.
Right. So you had the equation. It sounds like we had not only the centers lined up towards the program, the project, but you had the agency lined up and supportive, and you also had the political realm and outside of NASA support, which is
and had plenty of work for all of the centers.
right.
Right. Although there was competition.
Yes.
Right. And how do you, so yeah, I mean, competition would be natural because the work
Sure.
is complex. People have different ideas, and there's also, you know, I mean, based on how you go. So how do you maintain a very effective large team? You know, NASA centers, you know, international, and also deal with, you know, those competitions? Or is the competition a good thing that helps get you to be more effective that you deal with? Is it a bad thing that you need to figure out how to stop, or how do you deal with that?
It can be very good.
Okay.
It can also be very bad if you
Yes.
push it beyond where it makes sense, and you have to, after a while, shut up and get on the bus and go do the job and quit this thing. But up until to a point, it's very good. There used to be competition within the labs here at the center.
As long as the competition is all aimed at getting where you need to
You
go,
bet.
rather than trying to
Right.
take more of the job yourself.
Right.
But that was part of newly forming the center back then, working out, you know, the roles and responsibilities and rubbing off the raw edges of a very hastily put together organization here at the center, at least at the working levels. But it's just a normal part of the process of sorting out roles and responsibilities. But once you do that, then you get on with it.
I have formed one very strong opinion about integration, that I feel like that it's a major mistake to have an agency or an organization that's responsible for one of the major pieces of the project, also responsible for the integration of the overall project. And it's only natural that if you're responsible for one of the pieces and you're responsible for integration and you need resources, integration suffers if you're responsible for one of the pieces. So NASA has made that mistake more than once, in my opinion.
Yeah, the mistake because of political drivers, or just we didn't think it through, or, you know, in
You
terms
need
of
an
design?
independent organization that's responsible for
Right.
integration, that looks at everything
Okay.
equally.
And maybe we're getting into a little bit, one of the issues that I hear nowadays is the pressures towards both managing the risk in a disciplined fashion, you know, in a method, in a process, but at the same time the ability or the demands to be able to be innovative and to do things faster, to be adaptive, and to do things, with greater efficiencies. What was your experience in terms of your career at Apollo and Station? How do you find that balance between having the right process, but also being able to adapt innovatively to what takes place? And do you feel you had more, freedom, to work that way?
Well, back in Apollo and on up, we took loss of crew, injury to crew, and loss of mission very, very seriously. And if possible, there was no risk. The argument frequently was redundancy. The argument was exactly another one just exactly like that one, which didn't make any sense up to a point. If you got a generic failure in one box, you're likely to have a generic failure in another one. So you look for unlike redundancy as a grid one. The risk we took was primarily in how to get the job better done, more efficiently and better. And that went from manual switches to dials and things to computers, et cetera, back in the early days. But there was no risk that we could avoid that was hurt the crew or injure the crew or loss of mission. Like Jerry said, it better not fail for something we did or our hardware or our software.
Yeah, one of NASA's main missions, in my opinion, was to ensure that everything was done properly. And we really managed our contractors and that see that everything was done properly and that there were no shortcuts taken and that everything was going to work properly. So that's really, we were more of an oversight organization. And I think we've kind of gotten away from that. One of the things that that NASA made a decision some years ago that I think hurt NASA somewhat. NASA can't tolerate failure. We build one of something, and it's very critical. You take the Department of Defense, they build 300 airplanes or what have you. One of them crashes, well, it's bad and what have you. And I believe NASA made a decision some years ago to go more to the Department of Defense concept, in that give the contractors the money and leave them alone. Let them produce what they're going to produce. And that's kind of the DOD philosophy, and that wasn't NASA's philosophy before that.
Right.
And I believe that's somewhat weakened the agency.
Okay.
That's
too
my
much of a
opinion.
focus on an acquisition, side or role.
Yes.
In fact, back during those days, we sent teams to train contractors so we could give them a contract.
Yes.
We spent a lot of time trying to train IBM, for example, how to build IUs and how to test IUs, which is kind of strange that IBM would do that, but that's what happened.
But we managed IBM, and
Yes,
that's
we
no
did.
mean trick back at that time. But
Yep.
but IBM listened to us, so
Right.
that's,
Yeah, we spent a lot of time down at their facility.
and we really helped a lot of companies out in that we, like I say, we taught them how to build things right with clean rooms and build components that didn't fail. So
And you talked earlier about you have to have the stomach for management.
yes.
And so it's making me think by the things you're talking about that maybe this is the time to ask you about
Okay,
that. What
well,
is the stomach for management?
What that really meant was getting up and making presentations before crowds, or being in the very tense situations and all, could you handle that?
Right.
And that's what they really meant by that. If that upset your stomach and you didn't sleep and all of that kind of stuff, then you probably really didn't belong up at those levels. So,
Right.
for instance, if you had a qual failure of a critical box, and then you had to go before the whole agency and justify that's tough times.
Right.
So,
And back during those times, it was very normal for people to challenge you technically.
yes.
But they thought they had a better technical, or they were testing you to see how much knowledge you had. And if you couldn't stand there and defend it, then like Jerry said, you were sort of put off in the corner somewhere.
You lived hard, yes.
You lived hard,
Right.
so you learned how to do that. But the plus side of that is when you went out of this center, you knew what you were talking about.
Yes.
Right. So you'd have to put up with being tested.
You bet.
It's a very testing culture, and having the stomach to maybe not endure that. But did you enjoy that? It seems like you
I
probably
didn't the first
enjoyed
time.
No.
But you, yeah.
But you learn to tolerate it.
But you learned,
Right.
you learned the objectives of it. It wasn't personal,
Yes.
so
Right.
it was technical.
Yes.
Yeah, and it was probably also a multiplier effect because you had to be able to do that within the NASA team, because in reality you have to then do that with industry partners, and obviously with your experiences internationally, you have to do that with internationals. And I think you had mentioned the importance of the credibility,
You bet.
and that if you don't have that credibility, you really cannot be effective.
It
Maybe-
gets easier if you have, as you get more respect from the agency.
Right.
And they recognize that you are competent and that you're really doing a good job, then it gets easier. 'Cause-
Yeah.
And you're not out to take advantage of it.
Right.
Right, that collaboration, that trust. I mean, you talk about expertise, and obviously there's a technical expertise in a career in terms of engineering or the science, and then there's a leadership, there's a management expertise. And did you have to what degree do you have to have both of them for the work that you've done in terms of project management and systems engineering and negotiating, with international partners? Could you be as technically sound when you're also being, a senior executive, or what are the trade-offs there? How do you maintain that?
Let me answer that
Okay.
first. One of the things that you have to learn as you progress up the chain is you have to think at the right level. And that's difficult for an engineer because they want to know all the details and all of the ins and outs of everything. But as you get it up at higher levels, you have to think at a different level, at a program level, and higher and higher. And that's the thing that you really have to learn.
Okay. Being able to look at a strategic level or
Right.
take account of everything.
And let the other go.
Right.
So
Okay.
if you're up at that level and you're not able to do that, then you shouldn't be at that level.
Right. So if you want to be able to still be working that subsystem, then you can't be at that level of management.
Correct.
Is what you're saying.
Yes.
Yeah. Any other thoughts? Or?
Yeah, I agree with that. When we started dealing with the Russians and bringing them in, we were actually the CDR on Space Station Freedom. And we were trying to protect our design as much as possible to not have to do a lot of redesign. And then you get too wrapped up in that, you have to back off and say, well, wait a minute. We've got to bring the Russians in. We don't got an option. So what are we going to do to bring them in? So you have to look at a higher level. You're forced to look at a bigger picture, as Jerry said. And then your first reaction is to, well, I'm gonna get my way. I'm gonna let them, bring up the rear here. But then you develop that respect for them, and then you begin to see the advantages, like the FGB we talked about, which allowed us to a lot better chance of making this thing survive early in the launches of this thing. And then you have to overrule some decisions of the technical guys to make all that happen. But you got to keep their respect and trust, and you have to explain to them. And they may kick trash can around for a while, but sooner or later they'll understand if you explain it to them. And they deserve an explanation. They gave you their best effort, put in a lot of effort, a lot of work, a lot of inconvenience, so they deserve your best explanation and reasons why.
Yeah, it sounds like there's a balance between maintaining the technical credibility, excellence, we know what we're doing, at the same time nurturing the relationship in terms of trust and respect that has to come together.
And that applied to the Russian engineers also.
Right.
And the way that I was most successful with the Russians, and I dealt a lot with the Russians, is I had to leave the not invented here syndrome
Right.
back in the U.S.
Right.
Right.
and give them a fair shot, and they recognized that was really working for the good of the program, rather than, because NASA in the past we've tended to be, for want of a better word, kind of arrogant. We know how to do things better than anybody else, and you're going to do it the way that we say. And we had to get away from that with the Russians, because they were very competent and very good engineers, and they didn't have a lot of money, but they recognized, at least in my case, that I was really after the good of the program rather than
Right.
trying to impose NASA's will on them, and that I would listen to them, and that I would go back to the U.S. and convince our management that what they were doing was okay. And we had a lot of discussions about on schedule or on time. There's a big difference between on schedule and on time, and a lot of times I'd have to convince the managers back here, no, we're not going to meet the schedule with the Russian stuff, but it'll be there when it needs to be.
Right.
And you have to have a lot of confidence in yourself if you're going
Right.
to come back and tell management, no, I'm not going to meet your schedule, but everything's okay.
Yeah, because you're adapting your situation
Right.
to, under the trust that will be there when you
Yes.
need it, and that's your credibility.
Yes.
Also, right. Coming down to the final few minutes, I still have so many questions. One of them, though, I feel I have to ask is, what advice do you give to young people, young professionals who are starting in aerospace, in terms of how do you have the kind of career that you've had? How do you enjoy what you do? How do you get to be this level of success? How do you work with others so fast? What advice would you give to someone starting out?
I think you need a mentor. A mentor is sort of the OJT, on-the-job training. It keeps you from, allows you to make mistakes, and it allows you to, if the consequences are not too bad, and allows you to innovate within the tried and true system that NASA has developed. The processes that NASA has, which can't be overly prescriptive. You've got to allow them to innovate a little bit. But a mentor is all important, I believe. And whether you have one personally assigned to you or not, watch the folks, watch the leaders, pick out the traits and the mannerisms and the management techniques that are good, and disregard the rest of them, and try to adopt those things. It's not really all that complicated. The bottom line, though, is, I believe, get the job done. You've got to, you can look good getting there, but once you get there, you got to be able to perform.
The task at the end of the day.
My experience says you're always promoted or advanced after you've done the job for a while. Always.
You've demonstrated yourself.
Demonstrated your capability to take on a bigger job. I thought I was the latest example of Peter's principle several times.
You keep getting stretched, you know, by mentor. Jerry, any tips?
I absolutely agree that a mentor is essential, and unfortunately I didn't have one, and that was a serious mistake. But you need someone, when you get into an organization, you need someone to tell you, okay, here's what you need to do if you want to advance in the organization. And you need someone looking out for you and aware of when opportunities come, and they have you prepared so that you're in a position where you can accept, apply for a new position or what have you. And that's a mentor. And if you don't have one, you better go find one, because you're really going to be handicapped if you don't have someone looking out for you. Yeah. And like I say, that was a mistake. I didn't have one. So.
Right. So, but obviously, I've heard both of you have been outstanding mentors. I guess I want to go back. You know, Dave, who was your mentor, or was there any individual?
There was several.
Okay.
In the early days in systems test, it was a guy named P.M. Hughes, who was my division chief. I admired him greatly, not only because of his engineering and management capability. He was a Christian man. Later in life, it was John Thomas, Jack Lee, and the Space Lab program. And then you pick them up as you go along. Right. There was people in the shuttle program who mentored me. Bob Ryan was one. Great teacher, Bob Ryan. First time I got appointed to a chief engineer, I spent a lot of time on his back porch drinking iced tea and him explaining to me what stress analysis was, since I'm an electrical engineer. and other past S&E directors here when I got to be a chief engineer.
So you keep picking up
as you advance, you pick up another one
right.
without totally losing the other ones.
So we're down to the final minute, and I don't know, it seems like there may be a question. Is there a question out there? If so, we got to do it pretty quick. Okay, so one final question from the audience that has been texted in.
Our question is, any advice for a young professional that gets sent to a different country? What do you get to know, what do you do to get to know the culture? Do you have any examples of this?
I don't know of a way before you get there except just wade in and make whatever mistakes you're going to make. They're usually pretty tolerant about us blundering in there. But I don't know of another way to do it except just working with them and understanding it, and trying to be understanding of what their position is, try to understand how they do things, and be conscious of that and try to adapt to it best you can. I've read up a bunch of stuff about the Russians before I ever got there, and none of it amounted to hill of beans after I got there. Yeah. It was all social stuff, which didn't help me at all.
The thing you have to do is, in my opinion, you have to accept that their culture is different, and there's reasons for why they do things the way they do, and it may seem extremely silly to you and it don't make any sense, but just accept that and don't make a big thing about it, and don't let it really bother you, because if it bothers you, they see that it's bothering you, and so just like for instance in Russians, if they're not more than if you're not more than a half an hour late for a meeting, as far as they're concerned, you're essentially on time. Some of the other cultures, if you're 2 minutes late, they're insulted. So you have to learn those kind of things.
So it's understanding the people, understanding the culture, and developing the relationship around the task.
Accept them for what they are.
Right.
Yeah.
I am getting the clue that we're at close-up time, and to me it's gone way too fast because I feel like I've probably tapped into 0.001% of your wisdom and expertise. But really appreciate Jerry and Dave, you coming and sharing some of your ideas and your thoughts with us, and it's a great honor to hear some of the stories and the lessons. And I want to thank Marshall Space Flight Center for setting this up, and Jennifer in terms of the Knowledge Office and the communications team and the public affairs, and again the NASA TV crew. Really appreciate it. It's been a real joy. And I thank you for watching, and I hope that you come back and watch the tape, and we'll continue the learning going. So thank you very much.
Thank you.